Vikings, also known as Norsemen or Northmen, were Scandinavian maritime warriors who invaded and settled a large portion of Europe between the 9th and the 11th centuries. Their disruptive presence had a significant impact on European history. These barbaric warriors from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were likely inspired to carry out their raids by a variety of circumstances, from domestic overpopulation to the relative helplessness of victims overseas. The landowner chieftains and clan chiefs, their retainers, freemen, and any young, intrepid clan members who were out for adventure and plunder abroad comprised the Vikings. These Scandinavians were independent farmers at home, but when they were at sea, they were robbers and plunderers. The Scandinavian nations appear to have had an almost endless supply of laborers throughout the Viking era, and capable commanders who could marshal troops into conquest bands and armies were never in short supply. These bands would raid villages and towns throughout the European coastlines while navigating the seas on their longships. The early Scandinavian word for pirate, kinger, was given to them for their acts of burning, pillaging, and murder. In certain instances, the precise ethnic makeup of the Viking forces is unknown, but it is reasonable to assume that the Swedes were responsible for the Vikings' spread into Russia and the Baltic region. Norway indisputably carried out the non-military colonization of Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and the Orkney Islands. Desultory raiding took place in England in the late 8th century, most notably the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793, but things really got going in 865, when a force led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Halfdan, Inware, and possibly Hubba conquered the old kingdoms of East Anglia and Northumbria and shrunk Mercia to a tiny fraction of its former size. However, it was unable to conquer Alfred the Great's Wessex, with whom a truce was signed in 878 and which served as the foundation for a treaty in or shortly after 886. This acknowledged the Danish control over a large portion of England. Despite being heavily outnumbered by new Viking forces from 892 to 899, Alfred eventually defeated them, and the spirit of Wessex was so unharmed that his son Edward the Elder was able to start the reconquest of Danish England. Small Danish republics on former Mercian and East Anglian territory had already collapsed before his death in 924. The more distant Northumbria fought longer, partly under the leadership of Irish-born Viking chieftains, but Eadred eventually extinguished the Scandinavian dominance there in 954. England was eventually included into the Canutian Empire when Viking invasions on the nation resumed in 980. However, the native house was quietly rebuilt in 1042, and Canute II's unsuccessful passes during William I's reign put a stop to the Viking menace. In England, the Scandinavian invasions left a lasting impact on the region's social structure, vocabulary, place names, and given names. Scandinavian expansion reached almost every point imaginable in the Western Oceans. At least 900 settlers arrived in Iceland, and from there, colonies were established in Greenland and an attempt was made to colonize North America. The Orkney, Faroe, and Shetland Islands, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man all experienced the development of communities during this time. Two Norse sagas, the Grenlandinga saga and the Erk saga, give substantially differing descriptions of the early Viking expeditions to what they termed Vinland in North America, land of wild grapes. Bjarni Herjolfsson, whose Greenland-bound ship was blown westward off course in 985 and reportedly circled the coastline of eastern Canada before returning to Greenland, is credited as being the first European to see mainland North America. According to this legend, a group of 35 men, commanded by Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, set out in pursuit of the country seen by Bjarni about 1000 and ended up in eastern Canada. Leif's brothers are claimed to have made more expeditions, while Thorfinn Karlsefni, an Icelandic trader, is said to have led a third voyage that spent around 3 years in Vinland. Leif is portrayed in the Erk saga as Vinland's accidental discoverer. All future exploration is attributed to Thorfinn and his wife, Gudrid. It has been determined that the Vikings first came into contact with North America in eastern New Brunswick, the closest location to Lansa UX Meadows where grapes would have been found, thanks to archaeological discoveries at Lansa UX Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland Island, Newfoundland and Labrador, since Recru, an unnamed island, was devastated in 795. Scandinavian invasions of Ireland have been documented. The battle continued after then, and Scandinavian kingdoms emerged in Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford, despite the fact that the native population frequently more than held its own. For a period, the kings of Dublin believed they were powerful enough to move abroad, and in the beginning of the 10th century, a number of them held power in both Northumberland and Dublin. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014, when the Irish Scandinavians, assisted by the Earl of Orkney and some native Irish, suffered terrible loss, put an end to the possibility that Ireland would be united under Scandinavian rule. However, the Scandinavians were still prominent, albeit Christianized, in Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, Wexford, and Cork when the English invaded Ireland in the 12th century. The well-defended Carolingian Empire never saw Viking immigration on the same scale as that seen in the British Isles, and outside of Normandy, there is very little Scandinavian impact on continental institutions and languages. The sole lasting Viking success in what had been Charlemagne's kingdom was the Duchy of Normandy, which was born in the 10th century from towns on the Seine River. Sporadic raiding did continue, though, until the end of the Viking era. The Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean beaches are further south than France, where the Vikings occasionally invaded but did little permanent damage. Compared to the Viking expansion on the Atlantic coastlines, the Eastern Viking expansion was probably less violent. While there was undoubtedly a lot of irregular raiding in the Baltic and the phrase "to go on the East Viking" meant to engage in such action, no Viking state was established there with the sword. The Scandinavians' largest eastward migration took them right into the center of Russia. Although the Scandinavians formerly dominated Novgorod, Kiev, and other centers, they were quickly assimilated by the Slavonic people, to which they nonetheless gave their name Rus, making it impossible to determine the extent of their invasion. 2 of the Rus commercial treaties with the Greeks are preserved in the primary chronicle under the dates 912 and 945. The names of the Rus signatories are unmistakably Scandinavian, indicating that they were the main traders. However, the Rus occasionally made expeditions to loot like their relatives in the West. After 1050, at the latest, they ceased to exist as a distinct people. A fresh Viking push toward the east seems to have occurred in the first half of the 11th century. The names of the men who accompanied Ingvar on his trips are listed on a number of Swedish runic stones. Only fabled reports of these eastward trips' specific destination and purpose have survived. The Scandinavians' involvement in the east also included serving as mercenaries at Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, where they helped to create the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor. The Viking leader was a historical character by the 11th century. Because Denmark was able to incorporate the most rebellious sections of its populace into its own royal army, it became a conquering power. Norway and Sweden lost their ability to engage in external exploration. Before becoming King of Norway in 1015, Olaf II Haraldsson was essentially the final Viking leader in the old autonomous tradition.